other people saying to them, I don't know how you do it. And I couldn't help but laugh. It's so relatable on so many levels. It reminded me of a story that I told in some book at some point. I was in the elevator with my 3-year-old and I think 1-year-old twins, and I was taking one of the twins to their physical therapy appointment, and a woman got in the elevator and she said, and not kindly, but she said, I just don't know how you're doing this. And I thought, it was like the 857th time that someone had said that to me that week. And I thought, well, what are my options here? Like, I'm just doing it. What else would you suggest, that I just decide that I'm not going to? I don't know. It's such a weird thing. So how relatable, how fun, and just, what a wonderful way. Certainly when you hear her story, you will understand why that this saying is relatable to her. It's not in a funny way at all. And yet the reason for her writing this book and what she's looking to share with others about her daughter and her daughter's perspective and her daughter's experience and the experience and the growth and the moments that they and the insights that they all went through while navigating her daughter's illness is just something. I just cannot wait for the book to come out and to park myself on a couch for an entire weekend with a very large coffee and just dive through it. As you'll hear, there are pieces of what she's written that she's not completely sure will make it through edits because, again, it hasn't gone through editing yet. And I said, well, if they don't, is there any chance you could just send me that stuff? Because now that you've said it out loud, even if it doesn't make it into the final book, I want to read about it. I want to know that part of the story. So enjoy every minute. Follow Jessica on social media so that you know when all of the stuff is coming out, and you can enjoy it and be inspired by it and learn from it and anything else, because that is what it is all about. Talk to me about Breathtaking, about the writing of it. Let's start there. Where did the idea come from? Where did you feel compelled to do it?
I have always been really comfortable writing in essay format, in how-to format, but never in real memoir format. That was something that was very new for me. And what happened was in 2014, my daughter became very, very sick, and we spent 3 months in the pediatric intensive care unit. And while there, I started writing some essays that were in Huffington Post. It was Huffington Post at the time, not Huff Post. And I wrote one called Life in the PICU, and kind of a lot,
Yeah.
I think people were very interested in that because, it's kind of this thing that nobody ever wants to find out nobody wants to find out personally, right? You don't want to know.
Exactly. Like there's a curiosity, but no one ever wants to live it.
Yeah. Right. And so there was a lot of time because we were there and my daughter was asleep a lot of the time. So I wrote some essays there, and those were, personal. And I had written personal essays before, but again, not in the long form memoir way. And so then when we got out of the hospital and we came home, my daughter was, so I guess I should kind of back up.
Okay.
So my daughter had an ultra rare disease called MERRF syndrome, which is a very rare form of mitochondrial disease, and later was diagnosed with a secondary disease that made her one of 6 in the world with this dual diagnosis. When she was 9, she became very, very sick. That was when we were in the PICU for 3 months. And when we got out of the hospital, she was what's called an eyes-on patient, meaning my husband, myself, or a nurse who was trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. So, and that was from 2014 until 2022. She passed away in March. So there was a lot of time at her bedside. She wasn't in bed all the time, but mitochondrial disease is an energy deficiency disease. And she spent a lot of time on the weekends. She'd be in bed, let's say from 2 to 6, and I'd be at the, bedside in the chair next to her bed, or in the evening when we were waiting for the overnight nurse to come. And one day I was just sitting there and I was like, I'm writing a memoir. I'm going to write a memoir. I wasn't even like a huge reader of memoirs. So it was kind of presumptuous to go from like, I know how to write a 900 word essay to I'm going to write a memoir, but I just like kind of knew that this is needed to be done.
And what's interesting, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because people won't be able to see this because it's audio, but your energy totally shifted when you went from telling, understandably, but when you said, I'm writing a memoir, you got this huge smile on your face.
Oh, like, interesting.
And I'm curious, I'm curious about that.
It was like, you know, I just felt I have this story here that is so extraordinary. And the thing is that when I started writing it, I don't think I even really understood. I knew that the facts were extraordinary. I mean, by like with the literal definition of the term, right? Extraordinary.
Yes.
And I knew the facts were, but I didn't really understand how much our story was extraordinary. And I kind of discovered that while writing. And that was such a gift.
How?
You know, because,
in what way?
You know, writing just like, here's what happened. Okay, nobody wants to read, here's what happened, right? So, but why did it matter, right? And when I got into really the why did it matter, and I went, and at first I was like, well, when I first decided to write the memoir, I started with a scene in the hospital. And I thought, well, this is going to be the story. It's going to start when she gets very sick. And the more I lived with that and noodled with that and worked with that, I realized that that wasn't even in any way, shape, or form where the story started. Because my kids, I have 3 kids, and I will always say I'm mom to 3 kids.
Yes,
you know, and we adopted all 3 of our children from Guatemala. Well, now I wish people could see your face because
I know, but okay. So there's no way you would know this, but my youngest daughter, who's 14, was adopted from Ethiopia. We started in Guatemala.
Oh my God.
And it closed.
The shutdown?
Yes.
We got our Theo, our 15-year-old, right before the shutdown.
That makes perfect sense because Nina's 14.
Oh my God.
Okay. Okay. Keep going.
Wow. So, okay. So then I was like, all right, well, maybe I need to start, you know, in Guatemala and, you know, about building our family, making our family, which is how we think of it. Like we built a family, but then, you know, I was like, but wait a minute, we didn't just like all of a sudden one day wake up and say, we're going to adopt 3 kids from Guatemala. So like what led us there, you know? And so it started going back. And so the book ended up starting way before I thought it was going to start.
Okay.
And that was really interesting to me to kind of learn that the story didn't start when she got sick. It didn't start when she was diagnosed. It started, you know, when I saw my husband skateboarding across the Diag at University of Michigan and was like, ooh, I like him. That's when the story started.
Wow. Okay, this just got really interesting because from a storytelling perspective, right, the bigger the story gets, the more sometimes overwhelming it feels to keep it encapsulated so that the reader doesn't feel like it's an autobiography, right? Like we're going to go back from, I was born in 1972 and you know,
and nobody wants to read the Jessica Fein autobiography, believe me.
So I think I might, but okay. So I'm sure. So keep that in mind because I do want to know how you worked through that, and if that was a challenge for you, even to feel like there was just so much. But I don't want to interrupt the trajectory of what you're saying here.
Yeah, well, you know, and it will be interesting because as I'm sure we'll talk about, the book is with the publishing company now. We're just starting the editing process. And one of the things that will be interesting for me to see is if we end up cutting the first part, if we end up narrowing it. Because, you know, so I was joking.
If you do cut it, can you send it to me?
It's a good story. I've got, you know.
I want to read it. Yeah. Okay.
Really, the journey to deciding to adopt was such an important part of it because we went through a lot with infertility.
Okay.
And I felt like that was part of the story because we felt ultimately when we brought our children home that the hard part was over. Like now we could rest and we were done.
Did they all come home at the same time or
was it 2 years in between each?
Gotcha.
You know, we felt like, okay, so our like roller coaster was going to be that. that whole adoption journey. And now we're home, and now life will go on as we always thought it would be, you know? And we had no idea, you know? So that's when we really needed to buckle up. And so I felt like that piece of the story, which really showed, first of all, how my husband and I each came to challenge differently, right? That ends up playing out, and that we had already been through something together. And there's some other tragedies that happen along the way. So it's kind of punctuated by that. And I think, you know, it's interesting because when I talk about it and when people hear what it's about, they're like, oh man, you know, like, wow, that's going to be a tough read. And I'm like, you know what, this book, hopefully, like, yeah, it is tragic, but I hope that people are really uplifted by it. And I hope that they are inspired by it, because that to me is what the overall theme and message is. And that's what we learned from her. And I'm hoping only that I can share that with other people, you know, to honor her, because it is as rough a story as one can imagine, but the way she chose to live, even in the midst of this horrific nightmare, was, you know, just amazing for anybody who encountered her. And for those of us in the family who were blessed to be with her all the time, what we became as a result, we're really blessed. So.
And to be able to share that now with more and more people who weren't blessed to know her in life, but can take that with it. So it sounds like it's kind of a story I almost think of like Russian nesting dolls. It's like a story within a story within a story, because all these different things do play out. Yes. You know, as you said, how you and your husband both navigate challenge and all those different things, all that is happening simultaneously to this main core story. There are all these kind of peripheral.
Exactly. And, you know, part of it also is this idea that as we're making the family and as we're building and creating our family, which I think, and I wonder about if you think about it this way too, as an adoptive mom, I don't think of us as like having a family. Like maybe when people are like, well, I'm having a baby, like we made our family. And I just, to me, there's something really beautiful about that, but we also lost a lot of family. And so I lost my siblings and my parents. And so there's this loss that comes throughout, or that is conveyed throughout. And also my daughter losing her functionality. And yet for us, and that's why I love the name Breathtaking so much. Mm-hmm. It was about, you know, there can be beauty, and there kind of has to be beauty when you have limited time, right? If you like, there's no light at the end of the tunnel. So let's light up this tunnel and make it as beautiful as can be. And so the idea of breathtaking and beauty to me is really important and such a core part of the book. Also, the disease took her breath. Quite literally, she lived on a ventilator. So those two pieces of it, and my journey to slowing down, because you have to be in the moment when you're in these situation like this. You have to be, that's all you have. And that was never my forte, you know, slowing down, taking a breath. And
hello. Yeah. I mean, I totally resonate with that. And you hear that a lot, right? When people are faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges, it's just like, some people will say it's and I'm using air quotes, but the silver lining, which of it is that you look, I don't know that it's not that I don't agree with it. It doesn't, but it's a fact that people cite, right? Is that they'll say, this caused me I had no choice but to slow down. I had no choice but to have patience and really be present in a way that was always very difficult for me to do. Right. And so once you finished, what, in terms of your process, did you write the whole thing and then decide that you were going to submit? Did you already have an agent? How did this all work?
Yeah. And it's funny because, as I mentioned earlier, I had written a book. Yeah. You know, I like to say it was when I was a fetus, because it was so many years ago. I mean, and the process, it couldn't have been more different, you know? So, but I did not have an agent. And so, and I read some books on memoir and learned that with a memoir, you need to really write the full thing before you can sell it, as compared to my other book, which was more of a how-to. I just had a few sample chapters and chapter by chapter summary.
Right.
And so
you saw that more on proposal. Yeah.
Exactly. So I wrote the whole thing. But the thing is that the book was purchased before my daughter died. So I did have to go back and write an epilogue. And I always knew that epilogue might need to be written, you know? So I wrote the proposal. I wrote the book, I wrote the proposal, and got myself an agent, and it was COVID. And
oh gosh. Okay.
And people were saying, like, everybody's down. Everybody is like, you know, it's the darkest of the dark. Nobody wants to read about rare disease. And I'm like, but wait, it's not depressing, it's uplifting. And they're like, we're not looking. So, you know, it took a little while.
Yeah. Were you committed to the traditional process for one reason or another?
I really was, until the end. I started thinking about, well, do I want to, you know, I didn't care, big publisher, small publisher, anything like that, whatever. But I for sure was not interested. For me, I didn't want to self-publish.
Okay.
And then it was, well, do I look at hybrid? Right.
And so tell me, what do you see as the difference between self and hybrid?
Okay, I will tell you what I see, and I may well be wrong.
No, there's no wrong. There's 100% no wrong. So that's why I'm curious.
So to me, self-publish felt like I was going to be just paying to get my book out there. Yeah. And I'm in marketing. I've spent the last 25 years as a marketer. So I feel confident that I could market it, but I wanted, there was something to me that I wanted a validation.
Okay. Yeah.
Hybrid.
So when you say hybrid, do you mean like a smaller house that would still pay you in advance, or because lots of times hybrids, it's still author funded.
So when I thought about a hybrid, I thought, right, I'm probably pretty ignorant about it, but what I read was that
I even get it wrong half the time. Like they change the terminology every 5 minutes. So I'm like, what am I? Because I run a publishing house. So sometimes I'm like, oh my gosh, what am I again?
Right. And so, and it is interesting that people may define it differently. Right.
Yeah,
so I felt a hybrid I understood to be, first of all, that you would be, the manuscript would be accepted, that they don't accept all of them. And that Absolutely. I would, And so even that felt a little bit better to me. Mm-hmm. And maybe it was because, who knows if it's ego or if it's because I had this big publisher with the first book, I don't know. And then they would accept it, is how I understood hybrid. And I would pay some money, and then I would have a team. So I would have professionals doing the design and professionals.
Absolutely.
And that was pretty intriguing. And I think I could have been.
Feel like, so, because the way I see hybrid is like, you do have a team, right? They're doing your cover design, your interior formatting, giving you ISBNs, but you have the final say. So the hybrid isn't saying, we don't like this title, which by the way, I would never say this, but we don't like the title breathtaking. We want to change it to be X because we think that'll sell better. You have full whatever. But with self-publishing, you are doing all of that on your own. You are finding a cover designer. Okay.
Yes. And so I liked and so I didn't want to do that, the self-publishing. Yeah. I could have seen hybrid as a viable route. I mean, that could have been a different way I ended up going, but
but it worked out. This is how it worked out.
And the other thing that I did like with self-publishing, I knew that I could get it out quickly.
Sure.
And, because as much as I've learned to slow down and take a breath, patience is still not exactly the thing that comes so easily to me. Mm-hmm. So, but so that's where we ended up.
So what does the timeline for it look like? Because you mentioned you're just going into editing.
Yes. And so it's 2024.
Okay.
And, so here we are talking in the beginning of November 22.
Yeah.
And that seems really far. And I don't want, when people say things like, oh, it'll be here before you know it. And I don't like that, because I don't want time to speed up. Like I like, after everything that's happened, like I'm good with it feeling like it's, 2 years, a year and a half, whatever it ends up being. And it just means I'm going to find other creative projects to do in the interim. And so that's kind of exciting, because I've got a lot of ideas there.
This is the first time I've ever talked to anyone who is like, the book is finished, but there are so many interesting, and I put air quotes around finished. There's so many interesting components to this. One, you turned the book sold before your daughter passed away. So that adds a level of, you added an epilogue, but it's a level of, well, wait a minute, small shift. And then as you go through the editing process, it would be so fascinating to learn, okay, how does this all, because that is one big difference between the traditional and the hybrid, we'll say, route. Because with the hybrid route, you would hire your own editor and you would work with them very much in partnership. But at the end of the day, the decisions would be yours. So if the editor said, well, you know what, Jessica, I think we need to take out all this stuff about meeting your husband and blah, 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 you would say, I don't want to. But if your editor at the traditional house says, you know what, Jessica, we're going to take all this out, you may not have as much of a say because you're under contract, right? So it'll just be, and sometimes people have phenomenal experiences with their editors where it is, I mean, everything's an exception and great things. I know a lot of people who publish traditionally and have great experiences because they have great editors and they have great teams. And then the reverse can be true as well. So it's a very independent experience for each person.
And, I felt like from the start, I felt like I want to have a terrific, obviously I want to have a terrific editor, but I want an editor. I don't want to presume. I mean, it's obviously the most personal story one can write. And so I want and I welcome that editing process. I feel it needs it. I'm in every way too close to it to know. And so I'm looking forward to that process. I think it'll be hard. I'm so defensive.
Oh, I love it. I love it so much because I am an editor and I have a hard time also being edited because same thing. We just take things personally and we want, oh my gosh, just like you said with the validation, right? We want the editor to read it and say, this is the greatest thing I have zero suggestions. Like even all of your commas are perfectly in place and you used a semicolon perfectly in every instance. I've got nothing for you. But were that to happen, that would be the mark of someone who didn't actually read your book.
And I will tell you that with my first book, there was such light editing. And I always felt like, you know what, they should have done more.
That's so interesting.
Yeah, it needed it. But I was young and I had a very young editor, and who knows, probably they said to the young editor, oh, here's this young author and you guys, but I don't think
and away you go. Really right. Well, it all comes with growth, right? And being able to say, but I have to imagine, I want to ask you what your favorite part to write was. Is that something you can share? Was there a piece that was just, or a point in time, or that was just, you just loved writing it and maybe even fell more in love with the story itself through writing it?
I love that question. First of all, there were a few times when I laughed out loud and I was like, okay, this is working if it's making me laugh. But I think probably my favorite part to write was when we were in Guatemala adopting our eldest. Because the whole notion of anybody thinking we were equipped to all of a sudden have a 15-month-old kid left to ourselves, and there we are in Guatemala with this 15-month-old baby having no idea what we were doing, and just thinking back and putting myself back in that place. And of course, it was so joyous. It was the grand prize after we'd been waiting for 5 years, but it was so scary, and all of those emotions, which feel like a lifetime ago, I loved being back there with that
Yes.
optimism. Everything was in front of us then. So it was fun to visit that place in my book.
And in your mind, right? And,
Yeah.
and that's the interesting thing about writing, is that it's important to go back, like, to really put yourself into that space.
Yeah.
And I remember I was talking to Annabelle Monahan, who wrote Nora Goes Off Script, which is fiction. Mm-hmm. And it was so interesting to me to talk to her about her writing process, because even though it was fiction, she said, I couldn't just sit down and just whip out, 15 minutes worth of writing. I had to get into this character. I had to really get into this space. And I think when we're writing memoir, the same is true, because in order for the reader to be able to really feel the same thing that you were feeling, you have to go about, and sometimes that's very challenging, as I know, right? To put yourself back in those spaces.
Definitely. There was so much of it that was like, ooh, do I want to put a foot in there? That's so, and so the part of, becoming a mom, that was just a great place to go. And it was interesting because my husband has always been like the person who reads whatever I write, and he's an English teacher and he's a brilliant writer. And there were parts of it, because it was our story, that were just too raw and too hard as we were going, as we were at the bedside, and as we're it was just so painful. So maybe it's, the next book will be comedy.
Right. Well, and how did you decide, I'm sure there were parts, or I don't want to assume, but that you decided not to include because maybe it wasn't, maybe your husband wasn't comfortable with that being included. How did you work through those sorts of things when there are other people in the story, but they have a right to say, I don't want everyone to know about that?
Yes. And I will say, for me, that came to bear most powerfully with my other kids. So I felt like at their ages now, which they're now 15 and 20. So Dahlia was the middle. They have, this was their story too. This was their grief, and is their grief too. And it's just too raw and not mine to tell. So while there are obviously they're there, and they are main characters, there's a lot that had to do with them that I felt I'm not doing that. I'm
not going to touch this. Yeah.
And my husband was pretty generous about saying to me, you can do whatever you want with me. He said that he was fine with that, but the kids I felt really protective of.
Yes. And how did you work through the sections of the book that you wanted to write and you felt comfortable writing, but were just so, you didn't even want to dip your toe into that? How did you, when I work with authors who are writing about really hard, it's so understandable that a common sort of narrative is, I'll do it tomorrow. I can think of a million other things I really should be doing today, so I'll do it tomorrow. And that goes on for quite some time. How did you navigate that?
Yeah, I think that thinking about there are pivotal scenes that, knowing that those scenes were just so critical to the story. And I think thinking about it as the scene, telling myself, like, this is, on Saturday when, at 10 a.m. when I sit down, like planning when I was going to go to that place. That was definitely part of it. And, being able to leave that place. So, for example, so much of the trauma happened in the PICU. And we were stuck there. We couldn't leave for 3 months. And now I was able to visit and to feel it, but then to be able to, go out to dinner with my husband or go on a walk or whatever. So I feel like that enabled me to be there in a different way.
You knew you had an out, so to speak.
I knew I had an out, exactly.
Yeah. Ooh,
and for so many months, we didn't know if we were getting out.
Right. So what is your understanding now of this editing process? Because people, I think it's like a big mystery, right? Like, how does this work, right? When you're with a traditional house? Is there a timeline? Is there how what's your understanding of how this is going to go down?
Because everybody keeps, everybody I know who's not in the book world is like, the book's done. That's so great. So like, when can I get it? And I'm like, no, like, just don't forget about it. But, because it is, I mean, I was even blown away when I had a friend who wrote a book a couple of years ago, and she told me it was coming out in 18 months or something. And I was like, what? I'm like, I could write a whole other book, which I guess is what people do. Right. But
right.
Yeah. My understanding is that, so I submitted it, and some months later, which will be 4 months later, I will get back the first round of revisions.
Okay.
And even that, I'm like, 4 months. And then they're like, and then you can have it for 3 months and then get it back to us. I'm like, I don't need 3 months. I'll get it back to you. I was in for 25
hours.
years.
It's fine.
Yeah. I'm like, I don't need 3 months. And we'll go through that, a few times.
Yes.
And then we get into the fun stuff, right? Like the cover and, and the review copies and all of that. But I think that this back and forth is going to be taking us, many months.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's downtime. I mean, right now is really, really strange because it's the longest that this book, this baby of mine, has been out of my hands. And when I sent it to the editor, I said, I feel like the first time you're letting somebody else take care of your baby. Right?
Absolutely.
I said it.
Do you force yourself not to look at it? Because do you have
totally?
Yeah, like I would
still be looking
at it, and then I'd probably get myself fired because I'd be emailing my editor and going, okay, wait, page 72, second paragraph, I want to change the word this.
Exactly. So I am not looking at it, and it is the longest that I have not looked at it in years. So it feels really weird, and I'm just trying to really throw myself into some other projects that I'm finding exciting, so that I can not be obsessed with like, what does she think and what's going to say? And
how long was the full writing process for you? How long did it take?
Well, when I wrote it at first, quickly and poorly. And I was like, I'm done.
As we should. And I don't use the word should lightly, but that is my greatest advice. Write it quickly and poorly. Mm-hmm.
And then go back to it. But that's not what I did. I was like, it's ready. So I sent it to the two biggest agents out there. And I was like, and they both rejected it, of course, as they should have, even though we don't use the word should lightly, but it was not good. And I was like, it's terrible. And I guess I'm not meant to write this book. And, so I had to kind of just like live with that for a little bit. And then I went back to it. And then I learned how to revise because, as I said, like I can write the columns, and I used to be a columnist, was a columnist for the Globe. And so, I can write the 900 words and I don't really revise when I do a column very much. It's kind of like right as I go. And so learning how to edit and how to revise, that was hard for me. And of course, my husband, as I mentioned, is an English teacher, and he's all about edit. And I was like, oh, no. But,
and it can be really challenging. I mean, I'm working with an author now who is a journalist, and it's like, you have this perception in your head. Sometimes some people do of, well, a lot of people, more people than not say, well, I'm not a writer. I can't do this. I'm not a writer, even though they write all the time. They just don't identify with what they perceive that a writer or an author is. On the flip side, sometimes you have people like yourself and like this other individual who are they've written in a journalistic way, but now the book is different. It's kind of like going, I imagine, from, in a way, from theater acting to on-screen acting, or live theater to take 74. You have an opportunity to correct what you've messed up on, so it's the same space, but all of a sudden, when you're used to writing, totally different, right?
And it's so funny that you said that because, I was a columnist, and I have published a lot of columns, and I've written another book that was published, and now I have this book,
Yes.
and I still hesitate. I still don't feel like I can claim and say I'm a writer. I want to like
love
whisper
that. No, I know. And I love that so much because that's so common and so many people don't realize it.
Why though? I don't get, like, if I was an accountant, I feel like be like, I'm an accountant.
Because I'll tell you why I think it is. I think it's because it's a creative pursuit. And so like with an accountant, you've got training, you've got certifications that say I'm licensed. Same with being a lawyer, same with all those things. It's like, but with if you're a writer or a painter or anything that's and you're not really like there yet, whatever there is, it's terrifying, right? Sometimes to self-identify and be like, I am a. Exactly. I'd much rather say I have written, or I wrote, or whatever, but to say I'm it feels like I feel like I'm stepping into, somebody else's costume. Like the expectation shifts seemingly. If you say I'm working on a book, then there's no expectation, but all of a sudden it's like I am an author, I am a writer, I am a painter. And then people, let me see what you've done. And you're have you done anything I've heard of, people say, right? That would be probably no, but I'm still a writer. Right. I love that. Will you please come back when it comes out? I would be. Maybe we can even do like a midterm, like when let's do a midterm. I love that idea. Like, how it's going. How's it going, right? How's the editing? How did the editing work? What was surprising? How's the cover design? Because it is kind of it's a mystery over there in the traditional world to many people. And even to people who have traditionally published, as you said, it's changed and continues to change so much that even people who traditionally published 5 years ago, they get a deal now and they're like, okay, yeah, this is different. Not necessarily bad different, just different from what I expected. And so I love just sharing individual experiences, not to say this is how it will be for you, but to say, this is Jessica's experience. This is so-and-so's experience. I'd love to. We'll do the midterm check-in. Midterm check-in. I can't wait. And I'll link all of your socials and everything else in the show notes so that people can easily find you. Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode, this is your friendly reminder to follow or subscribe, leave a quick review, and share it with someone you know has a great story or message, but isn't sure what to do next. Also, remember to check out publishaprofitablebook.com for book writing resources and tips, and to see all the ways we can work together to get your book out into the world. Again, thanks so much for listening, and I'll talk with you again soon.